My name's Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas. This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, Something Awful editor Zack Parsons comes in to talk about his book, My Tank is Fight, Deranged Inventions of World War II, and his new project, Blue Stripe, going behind the scenes to a decidedly unepic science fiction world.
It was a time when anything seemed possible, and the desperate people just wanted to accomplish anything to save their country. I don't know if it's ever been seen on such a huge scale as this. I think you saw it with the American space program, the moon landings, things like that. You saw this, wow, we can do anything. So to a lesser extent, I think with the internet in its early days, with, wow, we could do anything with this new technology, and then the dot-com industry crashed.
Every single interview from the Marketplace of Ideas is available on our online archive. Visit us at www.colinmarshallradio.com/marketplace. You can download each show, or you can stream any of them in your browser. Join the International Marketplace of Ideas listening community by adding yourself to our Frapper listener map. The link is right on our front page, colinmarshallradio.com/marketplace. My guest is Zack Parsons, editor at the popular humor website Something Awful, as well as the author of a work of two-fisted pulp history entitled My Tank is Fight, Deranged Inventions of World War II. Zack, welcome to the Marketplace of Ideas.
Hi, Colin.
Okay, so this is a bit unusual for the show, since your book's been out almost a year already. Is that right?
Yeah, it came out in October.
Yeah, but I've never seen any book, or perhaps anything like it before. It's real military history. It's hard data. It's also fiction, speculation, some really cool pictures as well. How did the combination come together?
Well, I'd been writing articles called My Tank is Fight for Something Awful for a while, and the whole point of those articles was just to, show some of the stranger inventions of the Second World War. And with the book, I was kind of inspired by the books that were released in the 80s, and less so today, but they were about, like, space programs that you knew never were going to come to fruition. They would have pictures of astronauts living on Mars, and that was the kind of, like, lighthearted, fictional approach I wanted to bring to something as grim as the Second World War.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how did you stumble upon hilarity in the largest scale total war in history?
Well, I think some of these inventions are just so strange that I didn't really have to do a lot of joking around. I just, kind of described them. And
yeah, you just have to show is to make fun, essentially.
Basically, yeah.
I see. It was World War II specifically that you chose. What about World War II made it prime material for these ridiculous inventions, this military hardware that's implausible?
Well, I think the more desperate the different factions in World War II became, the more likely they were to turn to some sort of bizarre technological panacea, like the B rockets of Nazi Germany. I mean, those actually worked, and those would be, almost too good for this book. but all the countries indulged in this sort of engineering madness, but I think the Axis powers were, specifically Germany, were more prone to hope that they could turn the tide of the war using these bizarre technologies.
Let's talk about the origins of the project at Something Awful. First of all, how did you end up on Something Awful?
Well, I had maintained my own website, which was a news parody website called Geist Mag, for about a year, and Rich Kianka, known as Low Tax, approached me about filling in for him when he was away, basically. And from there, I just expanded my role until I was writing 3 days a week, and I've been writing that way since 2001. So,
How would you describe the something awful sensibility?
I would say it's looking at our popular culture and the internet specifically and just pointing at what is really stupid or bad and laughing at it.
So what from there got you to the point where you said, it's time to start a series of columns on obscure military hardware?
Well, I've always been fascinated by World War II and some of the strange inventions that occurred that were developed during World War II. And I think it was just a natural progression of, well, we're looking at all this other stupid stuff, and I'm interested in this stuff, so let's look at some stupid inventions.
So the criterion was stupidity.
Yeah, folly, basically. I mean, with the internet, it tends to it tends to devolve into bizarre fetishes and stuff like that. But I think the formula, the same formula applied here.
How were your columns received on Something Awful?
Initially, I would say it was probably about 80% positive and 20% like, why is this guy writing about World War II? But over time, it was uniformly positive, pretty much. I think people really enjoyed it, and the people who weren't into war inventions tuned out and came back for a different column.
So they got a positive reaction. What brought it to book form? What gave you that opportunity?
I was approached by Kensington Publishing to do some book ideas, and one of the ideas I floated to them was doing a My Tank is Fight book, and they could look at the columns, and the columns are still up on the website if anyone wants to check them out. They could look at the columns, and they enjoyed it, and they thought it was a good idea, so they told me to go ahead with the book, and it was a lot of fun writing the book. I went back to all the topics I'd covered in the columns, and I researched them more in depth. I wanted to give each one a better treatment than just 3 paragraphs. And then I decided to add some fictional elements as well to give it more of a pulp feel of action and, bring some of the inventions to life. And I hired some great illustrators, Mike Dosher and Josh Haas, Mike Dosher did isometric line art for each invention, and Josh Haas did the color plates that are in the middle of the book.
How much material did those columns, as they already existed, constitute for the book? How much were you starting out with?
Well, like I said, I re-researched them all.
Yeah.
So, it was a great template for me to work from, but every chapter was rewritten from scratch. And I was very careful not to look too closely at my own work when I was writing the chapters, because I didn't want people who had followed the whole column and really enjoyed it to get the book and just be like, well, he just stuck his columns in the book.
Talk a little bit about the research process. How deep did you have to go to find the data you needed on these pieces of hardware?
Well, I think the data really isn't available for some of them.
No.
I mean, you'll see question marks and stuff for a lot of the statistics, but
yeah.
I didn't. I'm not a professional historian. I'm an amateur historian, which is, you could say, is a mediocre historian. I just read a lot of books and talk to people. And
you're an enthusiast.
Yeah, about the farthest I went in terms of research was there was a claim for this giant tank called the Rat, that it has a turret that was actually built during World War II, was the claim.
Yeah.
And supposedly it was used as an artillery installation at a bunker in Norway. And I got in touch with a guy who lives in Norway, and he went and took pictures of it for me, and it was BS. It was not true. It was just a naval turret that they'd stuck on a bunker. It had nothing to do with the tank in the book.
Let's go over a few of these specific pieces of military hardware you've got in here. I'll mention some of my favorites. First of all, you mentioned already the Rat, this huge 1,000 to 2,000 ton tank with 8 20-cylinder engines. Is that right?
Yeah. The Rat is really one of my favorite inventions. It's one of those ones that I picked because it just awakens this imagination of this almost impossibly huge tank just driving over houses and the whole barns. And I mean, it was obviously ridiculous just looking at the drawings. That nothing like that would ever be useful. But It was one of the ones that the Germans pursued, and they didn't go too far with that one, not as far as they did with some of the others, but it was a really cool invention, one of my favorites, definitely.
It's essentially a fortress on treads, is it not?
Yeah, I would say it was referred to as a land cruiser.
Yeah.
And that is pretty accurate because the turret, which I mentioned earlier, was a cruiser turret from a ship modified to have 2 naval guns instead of 3 naval guns. And, I mean, it couldn't depress its cannons far enough to fire very close to it. I mean, it was just a real bizarre creation.
And you precede that in the book with the very first entry, the Mouse, which you read that, and I was reading it, and I thought, wow, that's a big tank. But then I turn the page, and I see the rat, and I think, maybe that's not so big after all.
Yeah, the Mouse was actually constructed, and prototypes were driven. There's plenty of photographs out there of, the mock-ups and stuff. And there were even some claims that it was used in combat briefly, but I don't buy into it.
The Mouse was how big compared to the rat?
It was, I believe, 188 tons off the top of my head. And, I mean, that's still enormous for a tank.
Yes.
And it dwarfs all other tanks of the time, and most modern tanks don't even come close to it. But, again, it was a case of bigger isn't necessarily better, especially when your enemy controls the skies.
Exactly.
If you have an extremely slow, huge tank, but you have no ability to protect it from the air, it's just a target waiting to get bombed.
There was some rumor that the rat or the mouse, I forget which one, could be disguised as a building is really the only option.
Yeah, that was a little bit fanciful, but the only option to really disguise it would be to put like a steeple on the top, try to convince the enemy that it was a church or something.
A little later in the book, you've got I think a rat scale sort of tank, but it's called the Monster, aptly named, I think, because it has this gigantic gun just in the center of it. It's like the rat, but more implausible.
Yeah, I would say it's a little more plausible.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think a gigantic artillery carriage, while still obviously kind of ridiculous, probably would be a little more useful than something like the rat that was intended as a tank.
At least the Monster could be used to hit stuff, potentially, in some universe.
Yeah, and in the fictional portion of the book, I have it kind of hiding in a bunker most of the time, and then they would drive it out to shoot the gun, which the Germans did similar things with rail guns of the same size during, Italy, Anzio invasions. They would shell the beach from rail guns that they would trundle out of bunkers, and then after they'd fired a few salvos, they would roll them back in so that the Allies couldn't bomb them.
Ah, that was the procedure for this sort of weapon.
I think the intention of it is obviously ridiculous because why bother putting turret or treads on it if you're just going to drive it into and out of a bunker?
Yeah, that seems to be a less thought-through element of it. And you mentioned that the Monster, the recoil on the gun would be such that a number of stabilizers would have to be manually set down to hold the tank in place.
Yeah, you would have to prepare the weapon to be fired. It would have to be braced, and there would be... I think in my projection of it, it had its own stabilizers, but it is just as likely that it could have had, external stabilizers that they would have set up for it.
You've got 3 chapters in this book, Land, Air, and Sea, and I want to move on to the air chapter. You've got the flying tank, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but a tank carried by a biplane, essentially.
It's sort of more like a biplane crashed into a tank.
Oh, okay.
It's just the wings and the propeller of a biplane hooked into the drive system of a light tank.
Mm.
And the engine of the tank and the gears would propel the propeller, and the tank would sort of fly.
And how would it get down?
It would land. It would, try to come in on some even terrain and not too fast, and they would remove the flying apparatus from the tank and then drive it normally.
This was an invention of a man named J. Walter Christie. Talk a little bit about him and what he's known for.
Well, I think J. Walter Christie is best known for his impact on Russian tank design, even though he's an American tank designer. During World War II, he came up with a number of tank designs, and the Americans really were not, he wasn't giving them what they wanted. He was fairly eccentric, and he tended to come up with his own ideas, and then once he came up with the idea, he would advocate it to the exclusion of the design demands of whoever his client was. Well, he developed some tanks, and the Americans weren't too interested, so he sold them abroad, and most famously, he sold them to the Russians, and they became the drive system for their BT series of fast tanks, and that evolved into the T-34, which is pretty much the most famous tank of World War II.
Also in the air chapter, you have a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft with tilt rotors, and this is technology we're still grappling with today and not getting it right. This was in the 40s.
Yeah, there were a lot of experiments with various types of vertical takeoff and landing by all sides. The Germans had several, including flying saucer, supposedly. It didn't work too well. The Vaser, look at the book for a second. The WP-1003. Yeah, it's very similar to the Osprey. The current, I think it's just entering service now, transport for the Marine Corps. It was plagued with problems, and tilt rotor, tough on pilots. It's difficult to achieve mechanically, and it would have been a nightmare then. If they had managed to get this to work correctly and got it into service, it would have been a death trap.
You mentioned that a few of these inventions in here, had they gotten up and running, they would have been a tremendous boon to the Allies.
Yeah, it's something like the rat we talked about earlier would have been a huge benefit to the Allies because it would have been an enormous waste of resources. Just building something on that scale, even if they had just built one, would have required so much resources that it would have seriously impacted the war effort of the Germans.
So to your mind, a single rat constructed on the ground would have ended the war earlier?
Yeah, maybe just by a week or something, but yeah, I mean, that would have saved lives. I think that's the positive way of looking at all these strange inventions, is that not only are they funny and strange, but if they had actually gone further, it would have been better.
It would have actually helped, I see.
Yeah, their failure would have benefited mankind.
Now, the third chapter, C, I have a couple favorites here. The first one being a boat made out of ice and wood chips, essentially.
Yeah.
And what was why did they want that? What was the advantage of a boat made out of ice and wood?
Well, it was inexpensive, and it was a way of, theoretically inexpensive. I think they were always a little optimistic with that. But it was a way of creating a means to base aircraft to protect their convoys going across the Atlantic for the British and Americans. And it was durable. I mean, you could shoot it, and it wouldn't really hurt it. You could blow holes in it, and it would still float because it's ice.
Oh, I see. And this was the work of another somewhat eccentric inventor by the name of Pike. I believe the material was ultimately pikerete, they called it?
Yeah, he didn't actually come up with the material. I think a couple American researchers did, but they obviously named it after him. They were working on the project for the Habakkuk was the name of the ship. And that was all his brainchild.
And what a brainchild to have. Now, there's another one I like in here in the Sea chapter, the Sea Devil, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a submarine with treads on it, essentially.
Yeah. It may be difficult for your listeners to imagine, but it was a small submarine, a mini sub, with tank treads on it, and it was designed to be able to quickly drive into a river and remain close to the surface, but shoot torpedoes at ships in harbors and that sort of thing. It could drive along the bottom of a river or something.
What would have been the disadvantages of such a setup with a treaded submarine?
I would think that they would be numerous. When you think of a good submarine, you don't really think of a tank.
Yeah.
And that's basically what you're getting out of something like that. The one advantage would be that you could quickly get it into the water, and it could show up in locations you might not expect to see a submarine, like a lake or something. But its performance was not particularly good.
When you were doing your research for this, how many of these devices were essentially one thing grafted onto another thing?
I would say there were quite a few. The Germans particularly like to graft planes onto planes. They like to stick two planes together, a big plane and a small plane, called a parasite plane. All of the different nationalities sort of indulged in this.
The early days of the
this
mashup.
works and this works, so why don't we put them both together and it'll work everywhere? the Russians, early on in their development of tanks, liked to make really big tanks that had a completely pointless number of turrets.
No, you just kind of scatter them around, hope for the best.
Yeah, you would have like 8 turrets on a tank, and how could a tank commander direct the fire of 8 turrets going 8 different directions?
Yeah, good luck with that. When you were researching, what were some of your favorites? What pieces of hardware delighted you the most to find things out about?
I really enjoyed the Horton H-09. It's a tailless flying wing design jet aircraft.
The one that was partially wood?
Yes, it was built out of wood, and therefore resistant to radar detection. It was just amazing. I mean, I knew that a prototype existed for this aircraft, but going into it, all I knew was that it looked cool, basically. That was my starting point for most of these, was just whether or not it was cool.
Yeah.
And the more I read about it, I mean, really was an amazing aircraft. They had the version covered in the book is a night fighter, so it had radar detection built in, and it was resistant to radar detection itself, and it had an incredibly high altitude ceiling, so that the crew had to wear pressure suits. I mean, it was really an interesting aircraft.
Would any of these have been a real advantage for the side employing them, or were they all boondoggles that would have harmed them?
Well, it's you could say some of them might have benefited the side employing them. Like, if they had managed to develop a working nuclear device, the Germans would have benefited from that.
Yeah.
But thankfully, they did not.
What held them back from that?
I think the number one answer is the Nazis held them back from that, because the Nazis and their oppressive regime drove out most of the best scientists from the nuclear and physics arena, and they were left with Heisenberg, who was good, and this Diebner character who is covered in the book.
Yeah, what was his story?
Well, he was a true believer. Heisenberg was not a true believer. Diebner was. So its newer research about this indicates that he had a parallel nuclear research program to Heisenberg's, and it was actually farther along than Heisenberg.
And what did he come up with by the end?
Well, my personal belief is that he did not come up with much of anything. He managed to melt down a reactor and contaminate the ground. Other historians believe he may have tested some sort of atomic device. And this would have been very late in the war, and there's only a few eyewitness accounts of something like this. So I would be highly skeptical that they got that far.
This phenomenon you mentioned of Nazi brain drain, I'll call it, is that part of the reason that so many of the inventions in this book happen to be German?
Well, no, I don't think so. No. I think maybe that they don't work is why why that is. But I think the Germans, the reason so many of them in the book are German is because the Germans were extremely desperate at the end of the war. And they had a huge industrial base, so they had a lot of technology, but they were just being plastered on all sides, by 44 and 45. And, that spurred their development of all these attempts to rectify that.
Considering how creative the Japanese can be with technology, I was surprised to find nothing from them in here.
Yeah, there are some inventions, and I got yelled at a little bit for by readers for not including some of the Japanese inventions I had covered on the website in the book.
What ridiculous things did they come up with?
Well, they had an enormous aircraft-carrying submarine. They had some very interesting jet aircraft. They had developed plague bombs using rats carrying the Black Plague. A lot of their inventions benefited from a technology exchange with the Germans. I don't want to downplay their own innovation, though. They had plenty of crazy inventions as well.
That submarine that was also an aircraft carrier. What did it do when it dove?
Well, basically they had a very small strip on the top of the submarine.
Yeah.
And a huge hatch that they would open, and they would wheel the plane out, and it would take off, and then they would hopefully recover the aircraft somehow. I think they were seaplanes. I don't. It was years ago that I wrote this, but I believe they were seaplanes, and they had basically very little offensive capability. So it was ridiculous.
A lot of this stuff, it just seems way too ambitious for 1940s technology, even a little ambitious for 2000s technology in some German cases.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what drove me to this project is the mindset of developers during that period. They were making such huge strides technologically that they basically saw themselves without limit when it came to coming up with ideas. And I think you see some real pioneering done on all fronts in this book, but they tended not to work out in 1940.
The engineers started to believe their own hype. Yeah.
I think that the engineers became a little full of themselves. I wouldn't obviously say that about all of them, but it was a time when anything seemed possible, and the desperate people just wanted to accomplish anything to save their country.
The spirit of everything being possible has it or has it not been seen since?
Oh, I don't know if it's ever been seen on such a huge scale as this. I think you saw it with the American space program, the moon landings, things like that. You saw this, wow, we can do anything. You saw it to a lesser extent, I think, with the Internet in its early days, with, wow, we could do anything with this new technology, and then the dot-com industry crashed.
Well, something awful made it.
Yeah, well, we kind of came in at the tail end of that, and we've survived.
Now, the illustrations in the book, we mentioned them earlier, how every device gets an illustration, and some of them, it must have been a little bit of work, a little bit of speculation to figure out exactly what they looked like. How much did you have to work with?
Well, in the case of most of them, there were at least technical illustrations. It was just a matter of taking these two-dimensional drawings and extrapolating them to like a isometric view. Mike did a great job on all of them. And then once Mike had rendered them in these isometric views, the illustrations were handed off to Josh Hass, who then put them in action. You know, he gave it the pulp feel of boom, there's an explosion and jets flying past it.
For those just tuning in, my guest is Zack Parsons, an editor at Something Awful, as well as the author of My Tank is Fight, Deranged Inventions of World War II. Let's talk a little bit about this pulp history genre. As far as I know, combining the hard data with the pulp history, this is a first. I don't know if you know of any examples that precede your own book?
Other than the sort of speculative stuff that I mentioned earlier of a mission to Mars or Jupiter space station or that kind of thing, I can't really think of any. But I think the reason is probably most credible historians don't like to indulge in fantasy.
I see, but you seem to have no problem with that. You put a chapter of fiction with every single device.
Yeah, I did. And I don't have any problem. I'm not a credible historian. I just think this stuff is fascinating and fun to talk about. So I wrote the book for those purposes, to amuse, not to inform particularly.
What inspired you to write these fiction chapters? What brought them about?
Well, I think, again, it was that idea of creating this reality, like a living reality for these things to exist in, rather than just, all right, well, here's what we know about it. Here's how they came up with it. Here's the statistics we know about it. Here's an isometric illustration of it. I wanted to combine, here's what would have happened if this thing had been built.
Sure.
And, here's what would have happened if they had fielded it in battle, and then, check out the color illustration. I don't want to read all that because there's a cool picture of it flying around or shooting its gigantic gun or that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's some serious action shots in there in the middle, that color photo section.
Yeah.
Or not photo, but, they're glossy, I'll say. Now, you use a cast of 4 recurring characters. Who are they?
There's Victor and Conrad Fleischer. They're brothers who are Germans. One's a tank commander, and another one is a pilot. And there's R.E. Lincoln, who is a reporter, a newspaper correspondent who is abroad traveling with the Allies, and he tends to get into trouble and go places they don't want him to go. And I'm not going to get her name right.
Avdotia?
Yeah, Donetskov. She is a Russian sniper, and she experiences the war, and through similar eyes to Victor, the tank commander. They actually have a run-in at one point.
So you had a sample of the nationalities involved in these characters.
Yeah. I mean, obviously I didn't include every single faction.
Yeah.
Polish soldiers and French soldiers and Canadians are mentioned, but no characters specifically.
You didn't want to write one of those elaborate cast of thousands of World War II novels.
Well, maybe another time.
So you think that kind of project's in your future?
Well, yeah, I'm not. I don't have any plans to write any more World War II themed books.
Okay.
Eventually, I may do a sequel to this or something, but that's not in the immediate future. I've got other plans.
Now, as I've said, this book it's a unique book. I think I can say that in a literal sense, unique. Talk about the marketing of the book. How did the style of the book affect getting it out?
Well, I think whenever they approach someone who has a built-in audience for their writing, they're going to want you to market to your base. And then I think Kensington is a small publisher, so they rely pretty much on the author to do their own marketing.
Oh.
So that's fine. The book sold pretty well, well enough to get me more book deals.
Oh, that's pretty nice.
Yeah. It's a niche book, and marketing it was pretty easy. You just kind of tell people what the book is about, and I maintained a mailing list where I kept people up to date on what was happening with the book and kept them interested with in work in progress, text and illustrations from the book and stuff like that.
How much rallying of the goons, as the Something Awful goers are, I believe, called, did Kensington expect you to do?
They left it pretty much to me. I mean, they obviously wanted me to do a lot, but they didn't shepherd me particularly or force me to do anything. I might have gone a little overboard with some of the advertising. Like, I think I asked all of the other writers for the site to write up something about the book for one of their articles.
Oh, really?
Not like as the whole article, but just to preface their article.
Just find a way to work My Tank is Fighting somehow, please.
Just drop it in there. So put a link to Amazon. I mean, I always feel guilty when I'm doing that sort of thing. I somehow feel like selling my work is betraying the trust the people, like the readers, have in me. Oh. I mean, I realize logically that's not true, but I don't like shilling.
Yeah.
I don't like trying to get people to buy the book, but it worked.
Did you get any of the expected calls of sellout from the goons?
Oh,
or?
No.
No? Okay.
No. I think they were all just really excited for it. I mean, we always have our share of detractors. It's the internet, after all.
Yeah.
Those things tend to spring up. But among the fans, no. I think they were pretty keyed into it.
Your book appears positioned in a lineup alongside of, this is the best terminology I can use, but it's what I can only call internet asshole books with your Maddoxes and your Tucker Maxes, which your book is completely not. Have you had any reservations about your very different work being lumped with that sort of thing?
No, not at all. I think, obviously this book has been overshadowed somewhat by, like, Maddox's book.
Oh, boy. It's at least your book has overshadowed maybe Tucker Max's book, right, though?
Oh, I think it may have sold about as well, or has sold a little better even. But that's fine. This was a niche book, and not everyone wants to read books about World War II inventions. And I don't have any reservations about working with those guys. I think they're talented guys. I don't read Tucker Max's stuff, but I've read Maddox's a couple times, and even though he's not up my alley particularly, he is writing jokes, and so we're in the same business in that respect.
It's the same core sort of deal?
Yeah. And I think I will be doing books not necessarily like theirs, but at least more totally humorous.
My Take is Fight is billed as a something awful book, specifically there on the bottom of the cover. Is this the first in a long series of planned books from Something Awful writers? Oh,
I would say so. I think almost every writer for Something Awful would like to do at least one book in their life.
So you're not the main Something Awful book writer. You're not the only one with these aspirations.
No. I think I was just one of the ones they approached at the beginning because I've been there so long and I've written so many articles. I think if David Thorpe, who I write Fashion SWAT with, if he doesn't write a book at some point, it'll be a huge shame because I think he's one of the most talented writers I know of.
I've read some of his stuff. A loss to the world is what that would be.
What?
It'd be a loss to the world if he didn't write something.
Yeah, it would be a big loss to the world if Dave didn't do a book at some point. And I think all of the authors for Something Awful are talented enough to do a book.
Do any of them have a book in the pipeline right now?
Well, Lotex could write a book whenever he wanted.
Oh, I see.
He has been approached several times.
He has that juice.
Yeah. And I think Max and Mona is his name as a writer. I think he has been approached at least once about doing a book. And, I think pretty much all of the writers could do a book.
So the Internet has proven to be a decent vehicle for a transition into the literally printed word, then.
Yeah, what you have to understand, though, is you have to build an audience before you can sell a book. You can't just write a book and put it on the Internet and expect to sell copies of that book unless it's amazing and you can get the word out about it.
It takes some ground level, getting stuff out there for free and then leveraging that?
Yeah, I mean, some people have released their books for free on the Internet and then sold it later after it's developed a following.
Oh, they'll put the whole thing on, just up for grabs?
Yeah, I've heard of authors doing that. I've heard of authors not only doing that, but then doing a podcast version of their book where they read the book and then release episodes of that as like chapters.
It's I
don't know if I would go that far, but
it's a counterintuitive way to market a book. You have to give it away for free in as many ways as possible and then put it out.
Yeah, I think you get people to like you is part of it.
I see.
So then they want to support you by buying the book.
How strong a fan base did you think you have to get before you were in the position to write a well-selling book?
Oh, I don't think I don't think size necessarily matters when it comes to your fan base.
Is it more fervor?
Yeah, I think it's excitement within the fan base. Like if you have 100,000 readers and they're just sort of half interested in what you're writing, they're not going to buy your book.
Yeah.
If you have 10,000 readers and they are just in love with every word you write, then they're going to buy your books. Or if like Maddox's case, you have 500,000 fans and they're in love with every word you write, then they're going to go buy your book.
So you give some credence to that old business saw that you don't need a lot of people to kind of like you. You need a few people to really like you.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And that's something that the Internet facilitates. If someone really likes you and wants to get the word out, they sure can.
Yeah.
I see. Now, have you ever considered writing about other wars, or is World War II the one that interests you? Or because you said you were done with World War II books, are there other wars in your mind you might do something about?
Well, I think like a World War III type scenario would be pretty interesting.
Oh, I see. Totally speculative?
Yeah, like the Russians versus the Americans or something.
Oh, I see.
Or even something more strange than that. But I think for my next book, it will. I've actually written another book, Blue Stripe, which is based on my series of Blue Stripe articles, which is like working class people in science fiction settings.
How did you come to that sort of scenario?
I like the idea of like a guy trying to fix a replicator. like you watch something like Star Trek, and it's always so there's no problems with the technology except when there's like a battle or something. There's no like problems with the technology, and you don't know who fixes this stuff or who maintains this stuff. And I like the idea of these people like cleaning a holodeck. I mean, what sort of horrible things happen on a holodeck?
That's something I didn't even want to think about, but now I'm strangely compelled to read about that now.
Yeah, well, that book is finished, so eventually it will be coming out, although we have had to move publishers with that book because of a previous legal dispute that publisher had with Lucas.
Oh, I see. There's some intellectual property issues going on here?
Yeah, they had a little run-in the past. I don't want to go into it too much.
That's fine. I just like the idea of science fiction on a highly, highly non-epic scale.
Yeah, that's basically it. Just average people in science, like these grand settings of massive adventures with Jedis and, starships. And the book covers all kinds of different science fiction settings.
You mentioned being a reader of speculative stuff as a kid. Were you also big into science fiction?
Yeah, I really enjoyed science fiction. I still enjoy science fiction to this day. I try to limit my intake a little bit.
You've cut down in recent years?
Yeah, I think unless you're reading the absolute best of science fiction, as with any genre, it tends to corrode your brain.
Who, to your mind, is the best of the best? Who are the most non-brain corrosive authors in sci-fi, dead or alive?
Well, I don't know if I would necessarily call him non-brain corrosive, but I really enjoy William Gibson.
Oh, really? Yeah, he's come up in a few of the interviews I've done lately. William Gibson, his fan base is larger than I thought. It reaches more walks of life than I thought.
Well, you know what? I keep buying his books every time he puts a book out, but I have to say I haven't read the last couple.
Oh, really?
Nothing against him. They're probably fantastic books. I don't have as much time to read, and I'm not drawn to read them quite as much as I used to be. But I think he's not only is he a great author, but he's a great guy.
Oh, I see.
I think he's a really cool guy. So
that's true.
I think he's one of the best. And of course, you've got the classic science fiction authors like Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov and those sorts of guys who were really on the cutting edge back in the day and have thus remained somewhat relevant.
The worlds of which science fiction authors would you have you thought you'd like to see the plumbers of, the holodeck fixers of the most? What world did you want to get on the ground level of when you were doing Blue Stripe?
Well, I think the Blue Stripe book is focused more on movies than on movies and TV shows than on books. But there is one that is adapted from a book, and that's Dune. I've always been a huge fan of at least the original Dune book, the very first one.
Yeah.
They got increasingly bizarre and perverted as the series went on.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely not a fan of his kids' work. But, I think that world is so rich and fully realized, yet there seems to be so much there that you could still talk about. So in the context of Blue Stripe, it's about a florist working for the Harkonnen.
Oh, wow. That's something that I'd never pictured before.
Yeah, it's a little bizarre, but
I would guess a lot of this had to come from your imagination rather than the text itself of these books, because they're following the epic, the weirding and whatnot.
Yeah, what I tended to do with the different installments of Blue Stripe was to, if not directly reference, at least like contextually reference events within the stories, but give them from the perspective of someone who doesn't really care what's going on. Like this big space battle that was the key of a movie or a book or whatever. really doesn't. It doesn't mean anything to some guy who's cleaning a toilet. He doesn't care.
I see what you mean. This is a little like the Tom Stoppard play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, if you're familiar with that, where they...
You know what? In fact, I have a chapter in the book set in the Matrix based on that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No, that is great. That's...
It's two security guards meant to... two cops who are working for the computer in the Matrix, who basically take on the roles of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
It's a deliberately Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead inspired sort of...
Yes, very much. They even start out playing a game, and they have weird games they play.
This is going to be a hit with fans of a lot of different stuff. Was that a concern, just appealing to as many fan bases of things as you could?
Oh, no. I appealed to myself. I wrote about all the things that I find fascinating.
Exactly.
Like, the bizarre... kind of stupid philosophy of the Matrix.
I'm glad you say that, because I bring that up to people and they will defend the Matrix to no end, that it is a very deep, they call it, film, but I don't know if I buy that.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed the first Matrix movie a lot. I thought it was like surprising and fun, and it had a lot of that quasi-religious BS philosophy, but it didn't take itself quite as seriously as the later movies where they would just have characters talking for 5 minutes in gibberish. Like that architect character was unbelievable.
I never saw the second two Matrices, but
you're lucky.
I've been told that I should pretend they don't exist.
Yeah. If you want to enjoy that series at all, you just should stick to the first one.
I take it there have been epic threads on Something Awful forums that have debated this very issue.
Yeah, and you know what was really amazing was after the sort of disappointment over the second one, people still got really excited about the third one.
Yeah. Maybe they're going to redeem themselves this time around.
Yeah, that was the assumption, but it didn't work out that way.
Being such a presence on Something Awful, you've got your finger on the pulse of a lot of this fan stuff, don't you?
Yeah. I think it's kind of interesting to follow the trends and what people are interested in, what's big and what's not. Like, we have a TV forum, and right now I think the most popular TV show is Kid Nation.
Oh, the one where the kids make their own town?
Yes, where they take over Bonanza City.
Is that still running?
Yeah,
Wow.
It's on, and the people, like, an episode of that show will air, and you'll go look at the thread on the forums, and there will be 450 posts.
I thought they ran into some legal trouble or something and got shut down, but they're still going. Wow.
Yeah, I think some kids drank bleach or something.
Yeah. I guess you'd expect that to happen sooner or later. They were prepared for that. I was going to ask you how much you thought the Something Awful user base was representative of the world at large in terms of interests, but sounds like they're disproportionately Kid Nation enthusiastic.
Well, I think anyone who uses the internet is probably more likely to be sort of nerdy, although not necessarily, but sort of nerdy and sort of affluent. Maybe not like rich, but middle class and stuff.
And Something Awful has done something that very few other sites have successfully pulled off, and that's they've charged for their forum.
Yeah, I think it's not a subscriber type of charge. It's a one-time fee unless you do something really stupid and get banned. So people just see it as a way to support the site, I think.
I see. Is that a big source of funding, or is it more of a keep the riffraff out sort of a measure?
Well, it started as the latter, and it has evolved into the former. Oh. I think it was kind of like, well, people just re-register immediately when we banned them, so let's start charging. And I think it's become the financial backbone of the website.
Enough people join at a fast enough rate that it keeps it going? The bandwidth use alone must be just insane. Yeah.
I think there's a constant struggle to keep subscriptions matched to expanding need for hardware, because it just keeps growing every year.
Yeah.
And requires more and more horsepower from the servers and the back-end stuff. So, it's a balancing act, and I'm not personally involved in the financial aspect of the endeavor. That's Rich Kanaka. But I think he does a really good job of balancing that and, finding ways to make money without seeming like he's exploiting the fans or anything like that.
That can be a pretty tricky move. I know those internet people are fairly sensitive about being exploited.
Yeah, and they tend to overreact at times about that sort of thing. but you know, if they actually get outraged, he'll listen to it immediately. He is very good at responding to that sort of thing and adapting to what people want and what they don't want.
The complaints are actually addressed, you mean?
Yeah, I think so.
Unlike in many internet ventures.
Yeah.
Well, at least they provide you a very large marketing force, a big street team, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Zack Parsons, thank you so much for coming on the Marketplace of Ideas.
Well, thank you for having me on, Colin. I appreciate it.
For more info on My Take Is Fight, visit www.somethingawful.com/booklist. Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. He also goes under the names Ice Ben and DJ Concept. Check out his website, www.benalthouse, that's BENALTHOUSE.com. Feel free to leave your comment, questions, and reading suggestions for the audience on the Marketplace of Ideas listener hotline. The phone number is 805-585-3947. That's 805-585-3947. Be sure to check out our website, www.colinmarshallradio.com/marketplace. All feedback, please direct to colin@colinmarshallradio.com. And we hope to see you soon on the next episode of the Marketplace of Ideas.